I was 17 when something happened that haunts me to this day. It was at the school where I had studied since I was little, an old school with gray buildings and dark hallways that looked even scarier at night. I was always one of the last to leave because I participated in a project after classes and would always stay until it got dark. On a Friday, close to 7 p.m., I was in the science lab finishing a biology project. Almost everyone had already left. Only a friend and I were still there, but he soon went home because his dad came to pick him up. I was left alone in the school, with just the security guard who, truthfully, was there more to sleep than to keep watch. Silence took over the building, and all that could be heard was the ticking of an old clock on the wall in the hallway. It was the kind of sound you only notice when you're truly alone. When I finally finished my project, I turned off the computer and started gathering my things. That was when I heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound. Like a whisper, coming from somewhere near the hallway. I got chills immediately, but thought it was just in my head. I kept packing my backpack, and just as I was about to leave, I heard footsteps. Slow, measured footsteps, and their echoes seemed to fill the hallway. I took a deep breath and convinced myself it must be the security guard making his rounds. I decided to get out of there quickly, but as I opened the door to the lab and took a step out, I saw a shadow at the end of the hallway. The figure had its back to me, standing still, motionless. It was someone in a uniform, like ours, but it wasn't anyone I knew. Her hair was tied in a strange way, and her uniform looked dirty, wrinkled, as if it had been stored away for a long time. That presence, even from a distance, caused a paralyzing fear in me. Then, out of nowhere, she started to murmur something. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was disturbing. I froze. My breathing was so fast that I thought I would faint. I tried to take a step back, but the lab door slammed shut, echoing down the hallway. The figure slowly turned around. Her face was pale, with a vacant stare, yet at the same time, it seemed full of pain and hatred. Her mouth was moving, but I still couldn't understand what she was saying. That was when I remembered a story that went around among the students about a girl who had disappeared years ago, inexplicably, during a school trip. They said she had never left the building, that her spirit roamed the hallways. I had never believed it. The figure started walking toward me, each of her steps reverberating on the floor, while her eyes seemed to look straight through me. When I realized she was coming at me, I took off running. My feet felt as heavy as lead, and every second seemed to stretch on forever. With each step, I could feel the cold air behind me, as if her presence was getting closer and closer. Finally, I reached the exit door and pushed it with all the strength I had, but it was locked. I started shouting for help, pounding on the door, but it seemed like no one could hear me. When I looked back, she was already very close, her hand extended, her eyes fixed on me. At that moment, I heard a loud noise, like the sound of a key turning in the lock. The security guard finally appeared, and he opened the door, pulling me out while I tried to explain what I had seen. He looked at me, laughed, and said, "This happens to someone every year. You saw her, didn't you?" Since then, I've never stayed alone in the school at night. And, from time to time, someone from another class shows up, talking about a figure in a uniform who whispers things and appears in the hallways. Some even say she calls them by name. Since the beginning of the year, strange rumors had been circulating among the students about a hidden staircase in the old school building. It supposedly led to a secret room that no one knew exactly where it was, but everyone who knew someone who had seen it told the same thing. Anyone who climbed this staircase and entered the room would disappear for a few hours and come back, strange. The story made no sense, and I always laughed it off, until one day, a few friends dared me to go alone and look for that staircase. After classes, I decided to take the challenge and explore the building. The school was empty, but for some reason, the air felt heavier that afternoon. As I passed by the hallway near the music room, I saw a small metal door slightly ajar, one I had never noticed before. It was tiny, almost hidden, and just below the main staircase in an area no one ever went. I got closer and pushed the door open with my hand, hearing it creak, echoing down the empty hallway. Behind the door, I found an old, narrow staircase made of cracked concrete and covered in dust, as if no one had been there for decades. The smell was strange, mold and something else, sour. My hands were trembling, but I kept climbing, curiosity driving me forward. Each step felt longer than the last, and the dim light didn't help much. At the top, I found a wooden door, slightly ajar, with a faint light coming from inside the room. When I pushed the door open, I saw it was a small space, with a stained chalkboard, some old desks, and a dust-covered window. But the strangest thing was that the chalkboard was covered with what looked like words written in chalk and then scratched out, as if someone had tried to erase them but couldn't. Among the words, I recognized a few that formed the phrase, "Don't come back." That was when I heard a sound behind me, like someone had entered the room. I turned around, but there was no one there. Just the sound of breathing, so close I could feel the cold air moving near my face. I looked around but saw no one. I got closer to the chalkboard, thinking it might just be the wind, and reached out to touch the scratched out words, almost by impulse. And that's when everything changed. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my hand, like the chalkboard was burning my skin. I pulled my hand back quickly and saw it was completely covered in black dust, sticking to my fingers. Then, without warning, the lights started flickering. The room filled with a deafening hum, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw strange shadows taking shape on the walls of the room. They weren't ordinary shadows but silhouettes of people. They seemed trapped there, frozen in agonizing poses. Panic took over me, and I ran for the door. But when I tried to open it, it was locked. I banged on the door, desperate, feeling those silhouettes creeping closer. I could swear I heard whispers and moans coming from the walls. Finally, with one last push, the door burst open, and I fled from the room. I raced down the stairs, hearing footsteps behind me, faster and heavier with every step. I only stopped when I reached the main hallway and turned to look back, but the door had vanished. It was no longer there, as if it had never existed. I couldn't explain what had happened. I went straight home that night and spent days in silence, telling no one. They say that, to this day, some students still hear whispers coming from that hallway. And if they look carefully, they can see the shadow of a small metal door that appears, disappears, and leads to a place where no one should ever enter. It was the week before winter break when everything started going wrong at school. I had noticed some strange things, flickering lights in the hallways, lockers opening on their own, and the sound of footsteps when I knew I was alone. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but after a while, I could no longer deny it. Everything happened on a Wednesday. I was staying late in the computer lab, finishing a last-minute project. It was already past 8 p.m., and the silence was almost suffocating. I got so distracted that I didn't notice the time passing until I heard a door closing in the hallway. I got chills immediately. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down, but the noises continued. I felt a weight, like someone was watching me, even though no one was in sight. Finally, I decided it was time to leave. I turned off the computers and was getting ready to leave when something caught my attention. On the monitor screen in front of me, there was a reflection. A person. Standing right behind me. My heart froze, and I turned around, but no one was there. The room was empty. I closed the lab door, and as I walked down the hallway, I noticed something written on the blackboard of an empty classroom. The sentence, written in shaky letters, read, "Find me." I figured it was a prank by some student, but the handwriting looked familiar. It looked like mine. I couldn't understand how that was possible, yet somehow, something in me knew I had to go on. As if something was compelling me. I walked down the hallway, passing rows of locked lockers. Suddenly, the lights started to flicker. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I heard footsteps behind me. The sound echoed off the walls, and I knew it wasn't just in my head. Every time I looked back, I saw shadows dancing on the walls, always close but never clear. When I turned down the hallway that led to the courtyard, I saw the figure of a person standing in the middle of the path. They were wearing the school uniform but looked dirty, and their posture seemed off, like something was wrong with their body. Their shoulders were hunched, and they kept their head down, hair covering their face. I wanted to run, but something held me in place. They turned slowly, and I could see their face. It was me. A perfect reflection, but distorted, with an empty stare and trembling eyelids that twitched in a strange way. This distorted version of me opened their mouth, and in a raspy voice, whispered, "Why did you leave me here?" It was a desperate voice, full of pain and anger, like it had been trapped there for a long time. I took a step back, but it took a step forward. Everything around me seemed to darken, and the cold became unbearable. I felt as if an invisible hand was squeezing my chest, suffocating me. "You need to go back," it whispered, reaching a hand out toward me. "Go back, to where it began." I didn't understand what it wanted, but filled with terror, I started to run. Each step felt heavier, and the hallways seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, I reached the exit and, without looking back, pushed open the door. As I crossed it, I felt a wave of relief, like I had escaped something that could have devoured me. The next day, when I returned to school, my friends said they had been looking for me for hours, and that no one knew where I had been. I told them what I saw, but they laughed, saying I must have been dreaming. Since then, whenever I walk down the hallways late at night, I see something out of the corner of my eye, watching me. A dark reflection, like a shadow of what I once was, waiting for me to go back, to where it began. In my third year at school, I heard a legend about a locked room on the third floor. It was a small room where, supposedly, the school stored items forgotten by students, old books, broken chairs. The strange part was that no one knew for sure what was inside, as they never saw the janitor open the room, not even for cleaning. The story went that once, a student got trapped inside. He was a quiet boy who always kept to himself, but one day, he simply disappeared. After a long search, they said the janitor found him inside that room, in a state of shock. He didn't speak, just stared into space, holding something that no one could get out of his hands. The next day, the boy didn't return to school, and no one heard from him again. Curious, my friends and I planned to peek into this room. We went on a Thursday afternoon, close to the end of classes. When we reached the third floor, the hallway was deserted. The room was at the end of the corridor, and the door was old, worn, with a rusty lock. To our surprise, it was unlocked. I carefully pushed the door, and it opened with a creak. Inside, the room was dark and dusty. We smelled rotting wood mixed with something we couldn't quite identify. At the back of the room, something caught our attention, a large, old chest with a rusty padlock. One of my friends, overtaken by curiosity, walked over to the chest and touched it. At that moment, we heard a click, like something had been activated, and the lights began to flicker. The room, which already felt sinister, became even more macabre. I closed my eyes, thinking the power would return to normal, but then I heard a sound I will never forget. It was like something was dragging itself from the back of the room, something heavy but invisible. I felt a cold presence approaching us, and when I opened my eyes, I saw a tall, skeletal shadow forming beside the chest. It looked almost human, but its edges were blurred, like a dark smoke with hollow, lifeless eyes. The shadow moved slowly, and its bony hand reached out toward my friend, who was frozen in fear. On impulse, I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the exit. We ran, hearing the sound of the shadow dragging itself behind us, closer and closer. When we finally got out of the room, the door slammed shut so hard the sound echoed down the corridor. We hurried down the stairs as fast as we could and blended in with the other students still in school. After that day, none of us had the courage to return to the third floor. We avoided talking about what happened, but now and then, someone would mention hearing dragging footsteps up there, as if someone, or something, was still trapped in that room. And the worst part is, sometimes, during the quietest classes, I swear I hear someone whispering my name, as if calling me back.